Started. So my name is Subha Lembach. I'm waving just in case you can't see me on the video, or in case you wanted to know which one of the many little video screens I am. And so my name is Subha Lembach, and I am the Juvenile Justice Community Planning Initiative, Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative Director, which is a very long title. But long story short, what I do is I work with our juvenile justice system stakeholders, including traditional and non-traditional community partners, um, and juvenile justice system staff. And we look at kind of our juvenile justice system as a whole and how we can continue to improve. And I know many of you, because traditionally National Reentry Week has focused on adult reentry, I know many of you are more familiar with the adult system. And so I was really excited about the idea of being able to share about the juvenile system today. And so I'm going to do, I know some of you are, I see FCCS, I know some of you are involved in the juvenile system already. So bear with me if I explain some things that are just very kind of basic. So long story short, the juvenile justice system is basically the system that is focused on youth, and the juvenile justice system, delinquency, status offenses, all of that stuff goes all the way back to In re Galt, which was a case from many years ago. But what you need to know about that case and kind of the subsequent development of the juvenile justice system is we know, and I'm sure if you've ever interacted with a child in your life, kids behave and think differently than adults, and children have different needs and a different developmental focus than adults, where we are much more developed from a brain perspective and a brain development perspective, etc. And so the juvenile justice system was originally created for that purpose. And the primary driver was to really think about rehabilitation of youth and to really understand that kids, I mean, let's face it, I have an 18-year-old and kids sometimes just do stupid things, and that's okay. And some of that, and a lot of that actually is part of the natural developmental process. And so that kind of created the juvenile system apart and separate from the adult system. And having said that, just some other words I'm going to toss around today just for you to be aware of. And this is a very quick, very broad glossary. So you may be more familiar with, especially if you watch a lot of TV, like Law and Order. There's a new one, Organized Crime. You might hear things like, oh, someone's guilty, or etc. In the juvenile system, we don't use that terminology specifically. We have our own terminology. We use things like adjudication, which you can think of as almost like a factual finding. And we use terms like disposition, which refers to kind of the outcome based on that adjudication. And then I'll explain some additional terms as we go through, but just to give you a sense, I wanted you to have some of that background. So let me go ahead and get started. So one of the things that I think is very exciting, and here in Franklin County, we're extremely focused on, is the evolution of our system. And so I always like to start off the story of juvenile justice in Franklin County over the past now approaching, well, we really started in 2007. So almost decade and a half is, if you think about it, and some of you may remember this time period and some of you may not, but back in the 90s, there was this whole conversation around the country about super predators, and really this kind of social science that has honestly since been debunked around, okay, we have these teenage kids, these teenagers, and they are a threat to public safety, and these kids are going to rob, rape, go after your Nike Jordans, whatever it is, and they're very, very serious criminals. During that time period, what we started to do as a country is we started to incarcerate and lock up more and more kids. One of the things I always like to point out, I always like to make this distinction because a huge, huge focus, and you'll hear me talk about this a lot today, is our focus on racial equity. One of the things I always like to point out about that super predator time period is while the rates, and I say this slowly intentionally, while the rates of locking up kids of color exponentially increased in some jurisdictions, nationwide, we actually decreased the number of Caucasian youth, of white kids who are being held in cells. And so during that time period, there was also a significant kind of increase in kids overall who were being held. And those kids that we were holding during that time period were kids of color. And so out of that, thank goodness, really beginning in kind of the early 2000s is when it gained momentum. We really started to think about what we were doing and how we needed to be more intentional, thoughtful, and, to put it bluntly, fair, just, and equitable in how the system works. And so one of the really exciting things when I think about kind of where we are right now in terms of juvenile justice is we are really focused on continuous improvement. And so what are some of the things we've learned in this kind of time period that have helped shape our vision moving forward? There are a couple of things. One is we know more than ever, and I'm going to talk about some of these in a couple of minutes, but we know more than ever that placing kids in cells for really any amount of time creates long-lasting impacts that are dangerous and detrimental. And I always throw this caveat in. I am not saying here that we do not need detention facilities or secure facilities for youth. What I am saying here is that we need to be deliberate and intentional about what youth, who we're placing in detention. That's number one. Along the same lines, a huge focus of what we have been doing now is looking at the impact of out-of-home placements. Looking at the impact of out-of-home placements, and that includes everything from DYS commitments to the use of residential facilities, in terms of what impact does that have on juveniles long-term, from a mental health perspective, from a high school graduate, an educational perspective, from a perspective of what does that mean for these kids who we're putting in placement long-term as they become employable adults and part of our communities. So that's something we're constantly, and that's really a vision moving forward that we've really started to engage and do a lot of work around. Another kind of real shift that we've started to look at, and I've got to get moving a little bit more quickly, is we've really started to look at racial and ethnic equity and inclusion, REI. You'll hear me talk about REI, and we talk about REI constantly. And so initially, when we started looking at the field, there was a focus, and it goes all the way back to even the OJJDP and the federal act, that supports the work of OJJDP. And sorry, I guess I should explain that acronym: Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency and Delinquency Prevention. And that's the nationwide, the federal kind of agency, and the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act is the act that kind of governs juvenile justice in this country from a federal perspective. And initially there was a strong focus on disproportionate minority confinement. Again, going back to what I said earlier, in terms of the extremely disproportionate overrepresentation of kids of color in the system. And one of the things I also want to point out here is when we talk about disproportionate minority confinement, it is not something, and frankly, the overall overrepresentation of minority youth in the system, it is not something unique to Franklin County. It is something we see in jurisdictions nationwide. I will note, and I always think this is interesting to point out, is the overrepresentation and the disproportionality can look different jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So for example, there are some jurisdictions in Arizona where the overrepresentation is Native American youth. There are some jurisdictions in California where the overrepresentation in the system and in detention and placements, et cetera, are Hispanic youth. And so that's something to be aware of. Having said that, and I'm going to talk about this more later, so I don't want to steal my own thunder, but here in Franklin County, based on our research, and we've looked at kind of race and ethnicity very broadly, in Franklin County, we focus on Black youth. And that's where we really focus our REI attention on. And that is because, and you'll see this in a couple of slides, we have a significant overrepresentation of kids of color at all decision-making points throughout the system, except for one. And we're working on this one too. The one decision-making point where we see kind of an underrepresentation of Black youth is youth diverted from the system. And so I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. And so I just can't ever stop talking about racial and ethnic equity and inclusion enough, but I know I've got to move us on. So we've really started to think about, and you can see in this next bullet point, we've really started to think about, instead of thinking of kids as these like super predators, how can we engage resources to support kids into becoming successful adults? And at the end of the day, that's what we all need and want. So how did we start it in Franklin County? What did it look like? So way back in 2007, at that time, now it's City Councilman Brown, but at that time, Mitch Brown was Director of Public Safety, and Administrative Judge Jim Mason from Franklin County Juvenile Court were at the helm of the Juvenile Justice Community Planning Initiative. It was created in 2006, and it was based at United Way of Central Ohio and really came from a significant amount of work that United Way had been doing around racial disparities in a variety of areas throughout Franklin County. And so at that point in time, we worked with, I was hired in March of 2007, which makes me feel really old, but we really focused on two neighborhoods specifically, and that was all data driven. And these were neighborhoods where we knew we had a significant number of kids of color entering the system. And so we focused on 43211 and we focused on 43205. And we really had started to kind of dive deeply into South Linden and the Near East Side. And we really began to explore data-informed policy and practice changes. So again, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it because it's ancient history at this point, but we looked at things like what disproportionate impact were curfew enforcement situations as they were then handled by CPD having in terms of the entryway of kids of color into the system. And what did that look like in terms of youth later being, we call it kind of deep, or I call it kind of deep ended into the system. And so what I mean by that, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but what I mean by that is when we introduce youth into the juvenile justice system, and this is one of the reasons we are spending so much energy focusing on diversion. When we introduce youth into the juvenile justice system, there is a much more significant likelihood that they're going to stay in the system and that they're going to be moved along deeper. And so when you think about it, and you'll see this play out in pretty much anywhere in Franklin County, kids kids do, you know, I talked about earlier adolescent development, and, you know, kids do behave differently than adults. There's a lot around brain development. Kids do stupid things in, you know, in the suburbs of Franklin County. Kids do stupid things in within 270 in Franklin County. And part of that is just natural developmental behavior. And what we really looked at from a data-driven perspective is, okay, when a kid does something wrong, they get into a fight at school, they're out past curfew, whatever it is, maybe they're skipping school, there are a variety of tools that the system can use in terms of addressing that behavior. And I want to be clear, none of what I'm saying is not about not having consequences for youth. It's about being intentional with those consequences so that we can support not just a decrease in recidivism, but supporting those youth into becoming productive adults. And so when law enforcement, let's say law enforcement encounters a youth, you know, I don't know, staying out late, vandalizing something, there are a variety of options they have. They can literally ignore that behavior. They can talk to the youth, have them stop that behavior, and have a very frank conversation about, like, I never want to see you doing that again, et cetera, et cetera. They could issue a citation for that behavior and file a complaint that doesn't involve a formal arrest in terms of juvenile justice involvement. They could arrest the youth. And so there's a variety of options that law enforcement can use. Once a youth, so let's say in those scenarios, police officer yells at the kid, takes the kid home, and, you know, sometimes, I don't know about you, but I know in my house, the parental consequences were probably far worse than some of the other consequences I could have gotten. And so they can let the parents handle it. If they issue a citation or file a complaint or issue a summons, those are all different terms you may hear. And they all pretty much mean the same thing. The kid will get a court date and they will have to appear, or there may be some alternatives to that in terms of diversion in our system that I'll get to talk about, hopefully. I need to keep moving. And so there's some alternatives there. And then if the youth is actually arrested, what ends up happening is law enforcement will actually call our detention facility, our juvenile intervention center. And there we actually score them on a detention screening instrument. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail. But there are a lot of different options. But what the social science, what the research tells you is that once we have a kid who has been kind of detained or issued a summons, anything like that, and they become involved in the system, especially if they've been detained, that's going to lead to a much greater likelihood of either DYS commitment, out-of-home placements, or probation, and we have juvenile community enrichment services in lieu of probation. But long story short, it's going to result in deeper and more long-term involvement for this youth. And so a lot of what we focus on is how can we be deliberate to make sure that we're addressing the behavior in a way that's really going to support that youth and the community wellness. So one of the terms I really like to use these days isn't so much about public safety, it's about community wellness, which includes public safety, but community wellness also takes into account thinking about how can we restore the security and kind of the community feeling of a neighborhood or an area. Because let's face it, if something happens to my neighbor, let's say my neighbor's house gets robbed, that affects my community wellness as well, right? It's not just about the perpetrator of that offense and the owner of that house. So we have been on this journey, as I said, for a long time now. And in 2010, we became part of the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. And my primary goal with these slides is to just give you a sense of the scope of this work. Because sometimes we think that, oh, wow, how could we ever try this new idea or this new policy or this new program here in Franklin County? But it's important for all of you to know there are literally at this point hundreds of jurisdictions looking at these issues, caring about the overrepresentation of kids of color in the system. And so in 2010, we joined with a variety of partners around the country and became part of the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, which came out of the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And so here in Ohio, we've slowly grown. We started off as 5 counties, and we are currently up to 18 counties. And so what do? We work together to look at everything from best practices across the country, learnings. There are a lot of different jurisdictions that have tried different ways to address, to address challenges, to come up with diversion programs, et cetera. So we have a wide network of resources. But on the other hand, what's really beautiful about the initiative and about being part of the initiative is, number one, and I can't emphasize this enough, everything is based on local data. Everything is informed by what we know here in Franklin County, number one. And number two, everything is based on the unique needs and community expectations. I don't know if that's the best word, but community kind of priorities around juvenile justice. And so kind of the purpose of JDAI, and that's what you'll hear it referred to, is to really think about how we can look at accomplishing the purposes of the juvenile justice system in the most effective and efficient ways. So it's really about eliminating the inappropriate or unnecessary use of secure detention. And when you see that, you might be like, hey, unnecessary use of secure detention. And truth be told, before we started putting into place some of the things we've developed over the years, 20 to 25% of the kids we were putting in cells because we couldn't find a parent couldn't get down to the detention facility to pick the youth up, or a parent refused to pick the youth up. And so what we were basically doing, and again, I'm going to talk in a couple of minutes about kind of the dangers of detention is what we call it. And again, I'm never saying here that we don't need detention for certain offenses and for certain youth charged with those offenses like murders, and significant crimes, but it's really about, does it really make sense when we know the research, when we know the long-term implications of detention, to put a child in there who has been picked up for a curfew violation, but a parent literally does not have a way of getting down to the facility. And so that's where one of the things we've really looked at is our use of detention. Minimizing failures to appear and incidences of delinquent behavior. So there's something in the field we call peer deviancy training. Long story short, I'll just give you a good example of peer deviancy training. I know one of the first things I did when I started back in 2007 is I would go sit in our detention facility and listen to how cases were coming into the system. And I still remember this because it was so powerful. There were 2 kids in kind of the waiting area at that point, waiting to be admitted. One was a 13-year-old youth who had been picked up for a traffic violation. And he was waiting for his mom to get off work and figure out a way to come pick him up. In the same room, right next to him, was a 17-year-old youth who had been in and out of our detention facility about 8 times, had already spent 2 years at a DYS facility. And so I'm just sitting observing, and before I know it, what do you think is happening? The kid whose only offense ever was a traffic violation starts calling the 17-year-old an Ethiopian warrior, and there's a lot of excitement building about this relationship. And so one of the things we really like to think about is, again, how are we using the resources we have at hand to really prevent peer deviancy training from Kids sometimes in detention, when you place them in detention and they don't, especially if they're there for low-level offenses, can actually learn more significant offenses. Redirecting public finances to successful reform strategies. It is a significant expense on the system to finance things like detention and placements. And again, that's not to say we never need those resources, but it's about thinking about, are we putting taxpayer dollars where it makes the most sense in terms of preventing recidivism and creating what we need for the future, whether that's a successful job force, whether that's educated youth, etc. And then looking at kind of the conditions in the facilities we have, and then again, this real strong focus on racial and ethnic disparities. So it's not, again, about releasing youth. It's not about not having accountability. It's not about not having victim restitution. It's not just a program, and it's not just about detention. It's really about maximizing the resources we have so that we can best serve kids to help them become productive adults while creating a system that is equitable, fair, and just. So a lot of what we do centers on collaboration. We work extremely closely with a variety of systems. We work with the faith community, and I'll put a teaser in for our 10:30 panel today. We work closely with the faith community, for example, on how can we better prevent kids from entering our system, and then supporting kids in terms of reentry. We work closely with law enforcement. We work closely with Franklin County Children's Services, Columbus City Schools, etc. We have a whole range of local and statewide partners. We work closely with the Department of Youth Services, and we get national technical assistance as well and national resources through the other JDAI jurisdictions. And so kind of what is this all about? What kind of ties it together? It's really about a relentless drive to do better. It's about equity. It's about using data and partnership with communities most impacted by the system. And we do a variety of things to kind of really engage our communities. But okay, I'm going to keep us moving. So impact of detention, I'm going to whip through these slides pretty quickly. But just know that we know from data that placing a kid in a cell for really any amount of time impacts their mental health, it impacts their emotional health significantly. And so, like, one psychologist found that for 1/3 of incarcerated youth, the onset of depression began after they spent time in a cell. We know that placing youth in detention will reduce their future earnings and ability to remain in the workforce. We also know that placing a kid in detention does not deter most juveniles. And I know that sounds counterintuitive. It's the same way oftentimes we hear like, oh, we should really create a boot camp for kids. Here's what we know from things like boot camps, from things like placing kids in detention. They actually do not serve as a deterrent. Why? And I could speak about this for days, but their real focus in terms of preventing recidivism and in terms of supporting youth with respect to reentry really boils down to what are the criminogenic factors involved that got this kid involved in the system in the first place, and how do we address those specific criminogenic factors. So I love this. I love this because it's really, I think, powerful. Prior detention status was a greater predictor of recidivism than carrying a weapon, gun, or poor parental relationship. So what does that mean? If you've been in detention, you're much more likely to go to detention than youth in gangs, youth who have kind of poor parental relationships. We've talked about peer deviancy training. And so we also know that adolescent development and the adolescent brain does not fully develop until the mid to late 20s. And the specific age really varies. I've heard, and I've read in different studies, anywhere from 25 to 27. And so again, what does this mean? And I bet if I did a poll, all of you would be able to come up with something, one time where you made a poor decision as a teenager or younger, right? And guess what? Pretty much most of us age out of criminal behavior on their own. And so what does that mean? And this is the hard part I always find for juvenile justice system folks to understand, is even if we did nothing, like even if we didn't put a kid in a program, even if we didn't do this and we didn't lock up a kid, whatever it is, most kids age out of criminal behavior on their own. So I'll be the first to admit, I engaged in things that could have been a status offense, probably even a delinquency here or there, but I never spent time in the system and I've aged out of that behavior. A lot of this is sometimes just the process of adolescent development. And again, that's not to say it doesn't need to be addressed and there don't need to be consequences, but it's really thinking about kind of how that's best done in communities. So just be aware of that. Detention, I've talked about this for a while now, but just know detention also supports kids in dropping out, using illicit drugs, and using alcohol. As I've said, and I could talk about this and I repeat it because it's my soapbox, but detention has implications for kids that do not support reentry in a successful way. And so that's something important for all of us to be aware of. And I don't think the community as a whole really appreciates kind of the research around this and the impacts of detention. So every JDAI site looks different. We are all focused on not just detention, but the use of placements, the increased use of diversion. All of our work is really based on collaboration, use of accurate data, objective admissions, case processing reform. So I'll just say a couple of things about some of these. So objective admissions criteria, one of the first things we did in 2012 was look at our detention screening instrument. The detention screening instrument is the tool we use to determine whether a youth has committed or been charged with an offense that's enough of a public safety risk, or there is significant enough fear of flight risk that we need to hold them overnight until a preliminary hearing in the morning before a magistrate or a judge. And that's the purpose of the tool. And when we first started looking at the tool as part of this process, and we've studied it, we look at it every year from a racial equity lens, we look at it every year from a public safety lens, and we're constantly looking at our tool. But prior to our current tool, which focuses on things like, is there an active warrant? What type of offense is the youth being charged with? Because obviously, if a juvenile has been charged with a homicide, we want to hold that kid until preliminary hearing. We want to make sure the community is safe. Prior to our development and really using data to look at this tool, the types of questions the tools had on it included everything from, do you have an anger management issue with the system? It included questions like, have you ever had an immediate family member who's been arrested or spent time in jail? And so we really, one of the real key things that we did as part of our initial work is really look at how can we make our detention screening tool something that would be much more equitable. On the other hand, and I always love to point this out, the way the original tool looked when we started this work, you could have also been charged with a significant offense and still not score high enough to be held. And so we had to create a whole system of mandatory holds to make sure that we were addressing public safety issues. So that's one thing I always like to point out. The other thing I always like to point out when I talk about this slide are case processing reforms. So when we looked at how long it takes a case to go through our system, and some of you may be more familiar with this than others, our average case takes about, when we did this research, about 3 months to get through the system. And on average, cases had just under 2 continuances. And a continuance is basically almost like a delay in the case. And so what we started to appreciate with that, because think about it, the example I always use with that is, like I said, I did some stupid things when I was a kid. If my parents had waited 3 months before they said, Subha, you are grounded for that one time, like 3 months ago, when you stayed out past your, your curfew. Does that create any type of, if I do this, then behavior? No. Does it really have any impact? No. All it does is make me angry, irritated, and it doesn't really address the behavior that my parents were trying to address. I mean, just think about it. If your parents punished you 3 months after you did something, or if you have kids, if you waited 3 months and you were like, yeah, 3 months ago you didn't hand in that homework assignment, so here's your consequence. And so a lot of what we've been looking at in terms of case processing reforms are things like, how can we make cases move more quickly through the system? How can we reduce unnecessary delays? And how can we divert more kids out of the system so that we can better support getting kids and families immediate access to resources and supports that prevent recidivism? Alternatives to detention, racial disparities, reducing the use of secure confinement for special cases. That includes things like warrants and a whole variety of other things, but I'm going to move us along. So what do we want for our kids as a system? We want to protect them from harm. We want to make sure they have opportunities, connections, and supports that allow them to thrive and grow. And we really want to, and this is really where we're headed, is looking at how we can partner with families and communities and really engage in bringing those voices to the table. We've done that in a variety of ways. We've had a youth advisory council in our probation department. We do focus group research. We've done surveys of families, but it's something, I'll be honest with you, we're constantly trying to improve and grow around, as we are with many other things. And so again, can't emphasize this enough. We really like to start our work by looking at data, and we look at data from arrests, referrals, diversion, our use of probation, use of placements, DYS, bindovers. So some of the things, okay, I'm moving us along because I think it's far more exciting to talk about what we've actually done here in Franklin County. So things we've done here in Franklin County, and these are just highlights. There's a lot more that I could really talk about all day. But one of the things we did is we eliminated the detention of status offenders. So a status offender, for those of you may not know, a status offense is something where it would not be illegal for you to do it as an adult, but it's illegal for you to do as a child. And so we eliminated holding status offenders. So that includes things like curfews, etc. There was a judicial order. Educational summit for SROs, so school resource officers in the Columbus Division of Police. One of the things we started in 2010 that continues to this day is to really solidify and strengthen the relationship between the courts, law enforcement, and Columbus City schools, particularly around the use of SROs. How did we even come up with that topic? We looked at our data. And so what we found initially with our data is that, I always have to pause when I say this, 98% of our disorderly conduct arrests when we started this work were Black youth. And when we started to dissect what was going on, so we knew that was something we needed to tackle, and we needed to tackle it immediately because of the significant overrepresentation. And when we started to kind of peel back the onion, and that's what we always use, because you got to look at and keep diving into that data. What we found is the location of a significant number of those arrests were taking place in the schools. And so we did a lot of quantitative and qualitative work with Columbus City Schools and the Columbus Division of Police. We had a very collaborative effort, and we really have worked to kind of not just strengthen those relationships, but really create a wide variety of tools and trainings that have reduced the use of detention for those kids. Detention screening instrument, I've already talked about that. Domestic violence respite care. So one of the things we were finding is that we would get a low level offense. I'm not even exaggerating. We would literally have like a brother and sister or two brothers fight over who got to play the video game. And that could end up with the kid in detention. And so we've come up with a variety, and DV Respite Care we did in partnership with Franklin County Children's Services. Okay, so there's obviously a family dynamic and issues that need to be addressed in that home. How can we address those issues without bringing in detention? How can we create lasting change in a way that really supports families? Restorative justice circles, I'm sure you guys are pretty familiar with how restorative justice works. But again, how can we keep kids coming from being pushed deeper into the system who don't need to be? I will spend a moment talking about the reception center. So the example I always use with the reception center, my daughter hates this when I do it with her around, but let's say my daughter was picked up on an offense when she was like 16 or 17, like smoking pot, gets busted for it. What are the tools I can bring to bear? I've got a couple of resources. First of all, I have the ability to say to my boss, Judge Brown, hey, you won't believe what happened. My daughter just got picked up. I need to go get her. I can get to my child relatively quickly. I can bring her home. What's going to happen when she gets home? Oh, grandma and grandpa live about 3 miles away. I can increase her supervision. I will make sure, because I have health insurance, that I have Google, I have a whole list of resources. I can call up all sorts of programs, and I will make sure she ends up in some kind of inpatient, outpatient, I don't even know what program, and all sorts of consequences will be had, right, for my child. When I get before that magistrate or a judge, what else will I be able to bring to bear? To be frank, we have a 2-parent household. We will show up in court. We will be able to basically effectively say to the bench, we got this. We know our daughter screwed up. Here's what we think is going on. And oh, by the way, we've already put all of these things in place. What happens in situations like that? In situations like that, oftentimes, again, not every time, but oftentimes that case could be dismissed. That case could be held open. There's a whole path that type of case can go down where the chances of my child actually ending up in placement or detention are a lot less. You take that exact same threat, that exact same offense, and you put that in a family that is just under-resourced, they're not going to have access to the same types of resources. And so what we did was we created the reception center and it became fully active actually in 2013, end of 2013. So we put it in 2014. And so what happens now is when law enforcement picks up a youth who they consider detention worthy, they're able to call the detention facility, go through this detention screening instrument, and kids and you'll see the numbers in a minute, kids will be referred to our reception center. At the reception center, they receive, and we do it in partnership with Adam H. The reception center itself is run by the Village Network. The reception center is able to provide a whole host of tools. First of all, they engage and work with parents. They bring parents in and look at how can we support this family overall. They do immediate mental health assessments, short-term case management. They bring into bear a wide variety of resources. And so they're able to do all of that. They have the ability to access, we call them alternative care placements. They are all licensed foster homes, but we call them alternative care placements because we also don't want youth pushed deeper into the child welfare system. That has a whole host of negative consequences in and of itself. And we also have evening supervision. These are all pre-adjudicatory services. So they are all voluntary for families, but they're ways of providing all families with the exact same supports and accesses and accessibility that just more lucky families have. And so that's a big piece of our system. And we've seen a tremendous reduction in our numbers because of that. And so that's our reception center. So we've also done things like racial equity and inclusion training. We've launched TAPS. TAPS refers to Teen and Police Service Academy. It's a mentoring program between police officers and middle schools. I don't have time to go through this whole list, but just know we've been doing a ton of work. So what does this look like in terms of numbers? So in terms of numbers, as I mentioned, when we started in 2007, as you can see here, we had, and I'm going to go right to this slide. So we had 4,059 admissions. So these are kids. So when I say admissions here, that means kids spent time in the detention facility. They were detained. And so that's what it looked like in 2007. As you can see through the work we've done over this amount of time, we've really made a tremendous difference. However, and again, as proud as I am that we've reduced the number of kids in cells, I want to point out, as I've said earlier, we're really about continuous improvement. And here, I'm not going to deny one of the things we're really needing help and work on is the continued overrepresentation of kids of color in the system. So in 2007, we had 2,785 Black youth admitted in our detention facility. In 2020, we brought that number down to 505, which seems like a success. But if you look, when you think about percentage-wise, the percentage of youth of color in Franklin County as opposed to Caucasian youth, these numbers should almost be flipped to be proportionally representative, if that makes sense. And so one of our biggest areas is really looking at kind of this disproportionate involvement and overrepresentation of kids of color. How can we address that? And again, I don't have time to talk about it in great depth today, but that's a huge area of work for us. So what happens?
Excuse me, Subha?
Yes?
I think you have a question.
Yeah, I will address questions at the end. I'm going to wrap up quickly. But in 2020, just to give you a sense of what's happening with our reception center, about 46% of cases are heading to the reception, 45% of cases are heading to the reception center, and we have about 46% of cases are being are in detention, but we've really brought those numbers down. I unfortunately am going to have to skip a bunch of these slides. So I want to make sure we have at least 10 minutes for questions. I'm going to open it up for questions. So yes, now I'm more than happy to take your questions. So if you want to just unmute yourselves and ask, that would be great.
Hello, good morning. My name is Anim Walimu. I'm the youth director at New Salem Baptist Church, and grateful for your presentation and to be in the presentation this morning. The question was related to the reception center that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
That attempts to sort of level the playing field so that families can respond appropriately when a child is has a contact with the system. How well resourced is that from the perspective, I guess, using a lens of are there folk who want to use it, can't because it's so overwhelmingly used, or is that something where you're actually wishing more families would make use of that service?
Okay, so number one, to make use of the reception center, a youth actually has to be arrested. So it is not something necessarily just open and available to all families. So I want to make that clear, because ideally in the direction we'd like to move, we wouldn't really need to use the detention facility or the reception center, because we want to divert cases out of the system. If we can get kids' behavior addressed without them catching a case, that is going to be ideal. Having said that, the reception center definitely has capacity for cases. It is well resourced. They operate 24/7. We wanted to make sure that if kids can be diverted to the reception center instead of being held in a cell, we would always have that available. But one of the things I don't have time to talk about today is we also have a whole host of other resources. We have everything from police-initiated diversion programming, which keeps a case completely informal, to also ways that when a complaint comes in, we have an entire department called Youth Education and Intervention Services, and they have a whole host of diversion programs that we can also use. So there's a lot of tools that I just can't cover in an hour. Sorry. Other questions? Anyone?
Well, I have another, if others don't.
Okay.
All right. So you mentioned that the reception center is for those who have already been arrested, and you seem to kind of hint toward you wish it was available for not just after you were arrested, maybe in other cases. Is that what you were the direction you were kind of going in?
Yes, we do definitely support prevention and diversion programs. And actually Project Faith, which is our 1030 panel, is one of the ways we're really looking at kind of prevention in the system, period. Another huge component that we've added that I haven't had time to talk about today is a partnership with Franklin County Job and Family Services, where they've created a family stabilization unit. And the family stabilization unit, FSU, they're also able to, at that initial kind of hearing, whether it's a kid who comes in through reception center or a detention, or just any family that's been involved with the court, even through our diversion programs, they can bring a whole host of resources through Job and Family Services, which includes everything from, job supports from Columbus State to Nationwide Children's Hospital for behavioral health. If grandma who lives in the house needs a ramp, they are able to put in a ramp for her. So there's a whole host of resources there. And then things like our Teen and Police Service Academy, our TAPS program, in partnership with the Columbus Division of Police, are also ways we identify youth who are, I don't really like the term risk or any at risk anymore, but opportunity youth. And they look at opportunity youth and how can we partner with law enforcement to do some mentoring programs for them. Any other questions?
Again, I have more if others don't, but I'm happy to wait.
Oh, no, go ahead. No one else seems to have a question right now, so go for it.
What do you see as the next big step of progress? Like if you could wave a wand, I know if you could wave the wand, it probably would deal with everything all together. But with the context of where we use the system is now, what's the next push ahead? I know you mentioned the racial disparity piece at the end. That yep. the graph line should be inverted to measure up. How might we get there?
Oh, okay. So let's talk about that. So when we talk about racial equity and inclusion, it is going to involve so much. There's no specific wish list I have, because honestly, I would want to change everything. I think there's so many different ways we can address kind of law enforcement and policing at the front door. There are ways we can change things from a data perspective around everything from our detention screening instrument and our mandatory holds to looking at how can we support families and communities, to looking at, frankly, even how are we making decisions. So one of the things we have not had time to talk about, again, that I could talk about in depth, is when we look at kind of the bindovers. So bindovers are transfers to adult court. Those decisions start in the prosecutor's office, for example. When we look at our bindovers, I almost can't say this without feeling a little nauseated. Many years, I haven't looked at the data for 2020, so I'm not going to give you a specific number, but pretty much pretty regularly. If you look at bind over, so the kids charged with serious offenses who are bound over to adult court, and I will point out, there are a number of bind overs that are required by law. So laws can always be changed, but that's something to think about. But we have years where almost every single kid who is bound over is a Black youth. And sometimes bind overs, again, are required because one of the things we're really looking at and that we've been looking at closely are things like gun charges. But having said that, a whole area of work for us is to really think about kind of what we do about youth with guns. We know that significant public safety risk, we are, and I didn't get to talk about the slide, but as you can see, it's a mandatory hold for us. But if you look at our 2020 data, our most frequent admission in terms of mandatory holds was easily possession of a gun. And then when you add to that kids on probation who were then arrested with the gun, so just looking at possession of a gun and kids who are on probation with an underlying F1 or F2, felony 1 or felony 2 with the gun, that's like over 100 cases right there. And so those are all, so there's a whole variety of places we need to make change happen in, but those are some of the significant ones.
Can I ask a quick follow up on that, on the gun piece? So in terms of I think bind over is the language you use. So if a 15-year-old is caught in possession of a firearm and is adjudicated, according to law, they have to stay over into adulthood. Is that what that means?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to talk about that case specifically, but yes, there are a number of cases, and you can find all of this in the Ohio Revised Code. But in the Ohio Revised Code, there are some things we call mandatory bindovers or statutory bindovers. And so, yes, there are certain situations, particularly involving guns, where cases are bound over to adult court without as much discretion as in other cases. But it is now 9:59, and I know there are other panels that people want to get to, and I want to be mindful and respectful of your time. What I am going to do is I will put my email address in the chat box, and you all are more than welcome to email me with questions, or if you have additional topics that you're interested in or ideas. So feel free to reach out to me. And thank you all for joining this morning. Have a great day.